We are thrilled to be joined by today's keynoter, who just has an extraordinary background, and we thank MTI for underwriting the keynote address today. I'm thrilled to welcome Gabriela Alcalde, Executive Director of the Sewall Foundation. Sewall Foundation, I would say, maybe the most collaborative and committed of the funders that we get the privilege of working with. They just go with us when they know there's a need, especially across rural Maine, with flexible resources that enable us to have an impact. Prepare to be inspired, respectfully challenged to find new ways to connect with others, bridge divides, form new alliances, and other ways of strengthening community. Gabriela brings unique perspective from her lived experiences and her varied career on community, equitable and inclusive economic development, and the intersectionality of those with our earth and climate. Please join me in welcoming Gabriela Alcalde.
Good morning, everybody. This is my first time speaking to this many people in about 3 years, and only the second time since moving to Maine, because like our previous speaker, I moved here about 6 months before the pandemic started. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'd like to share with you a story of how community became the ultimate manifestation of values for me. In my story, community is a creative and dynamic process, and it's an intentional practice. It is a dance that moves us closer to our collective aspirations. Community has been at the heart of every job I've had and every idea to which I've committed my energy. I've come to understand community as inescapable and a basic human need. My understanding of community is deeply shaped by where I was born and my life experiences. So please allow me to share a little bit of my own personal story with you. I was born and raised in a collectivist culture where on the spectrum of we versus I, Peru, like most Latin American countries, leans quite heavily into the we side of things. Because of this, I was brought up to value solidarity and mutuality as core values. I was told many times growing up, family comes first and definitely before self. Very few things upset my parents more than behavior that could be construed as selfish, self-promoting, or self-serving. Now, the story of my ancestors is a little bit more complicated, and it is full of erasure and unknowns. I identify as mestiza, which means I have both indigenous and European ancestry. For me, being mestiza has always been complicated, because it was never a peaceful coming together of the peoples or the cultures, and the original peoples of the land now known as Peru have suffered the depravity of colonization and its many reincarnations. The culture I grew up with would also be described as mestiza. I would describe it as a combination of cultural, spiritual, and psychological aspects of indigenous, Spanish, and Afro-Peruvian communities, weaving indigenous stories, belief systems, and knowledge with the Spanish language, the Catholic Church, and beliefs, and Eurocentric biases. I was born and raised in Lima, a desert city of 11 million people on the Pacific coast of South America. And my life was centered around extended family and shared meals that lasted entire days. Growing up, we learned a lot about the Incan Empire. And despite our colonized history, the Incas actually feature quite prominently in Peruvian culture and Peruvian pride. The Incas and the dozens of indigenous communities of the region organized themselves in a way that recognized the deep interdependence among all living things. This worldview was at the heart of the stories that I learned as a child. The Incas saw humans as part of a cosmic community, where humans are siblings with other animals, with the rivers, with the mountains, the oceans, the sun, the moon, and the constellations, all of us connected and bound in mutuality. The origin stories that we learned in school told of Inti, our sun god, Quilla, the moon god, and Pachamama, our earth mother. Every school child in Lima knew the story of Manco Cápac and Mama Ocllo, the children of Inti, the sun god, who are the founders of the city of Cusco, the capital of the Incan Empire. Through stories and school lessons, I learned about the values of the Incas and how they looked to nature for spiritual guidance and for their very survival. I specifically clearly remember learning about the critical role that seabird guano played in the Incan Empire, which made for lots of giggling and laughing in primary school. Guano, which is actually a Quechua word, was prized as gold by the Incas, and it was used as a fertilizer, which allowed the Incas to grow food in areas that otherwise would not have grown food, much like the coastal desert that I grew up in. Now, if you look at maps of the seabirds in South America and their territories, and you lay it on top of a map of the Incan Empire, they actually border each other almost precisely. As a child, I would imagine the seabirds flying together in relationship with this great Incan Empire. And in recognition of the vital role that the seabirds played, they were strictly protected, with punishment of death for anyone who harmed the birds or even their nests. Nature and its power are central to Peru, to its people, to its culture, and to me. And while the richness of Peru's culture, history, and natural resources provided me with amazing childhood experiences, the story of growing up in Peru in the 1980s is punctuated by unimaginable suffering and violence. Community binds us in times of joy and at times of pain. The 1980s are known as the lost decade in Peru due to the deep social and economic crisis. For essentially the entirety of my childhood, Peru was a country seized by violence, by terrorist groups such as the Shining Path and MRTA, by narco-terrorists, government corruption and state-sponsored violence, community displacement, and hyperinflation. And when I say hyperinflation, I mean I had to learn 3 currencies in my childhood as government navigated inflation rates of 50 to 70%, 5070% per year. Early on, it was clear to me, even as a child, that Peru was a place of extremes. Extreme beauty, extreme violence, extreme inequality, extreme poverty, and extreme instability. I remember my parents impressing upon my siblings and me that one should only take when one needs, never more. In part, they were reiterating this core lesson in our home in response to the news on the television that very well-off neighborhoods were hoarding powdered milk, rice, and bread when it was being rationed by the government. Meanwhile, in less privileged neighborhoods, community leaders like Maria Elena Moyano were forming community kitchens and mothers groups to make sure that every single person was fed, standing up against violence and terror, and sadly paying for it with their lives. When communities are unwell, they silence those who speak for justice, for love, and collective dignity. As a parent, I now understand that these childhood experiences molded my brain and have shaped me into how I exist in the world. And I also know that sometimes the darkest times in our lives offer the most lessons. I can never forget listening to one of my dad's childhood friends who was visiting us at home in Lima. He was talking about his son, who would have been just a few years older than my older brother. While his son was in the Amazon, he was kidnapped and later murdered by narco-terrorists. In living through this unimaginable pain, he and his wife had adopted a young boy from Ayacucho, a town in south central Peru that have suffered disproportionately from terrorist violence. He shared that he knew the only way forward was through love. Over the years, I have learned about the courage, resourcefulness, and solidarity that small, rural indigenous communities showed during the Periodo de Violencia, a time during which over 70,000 people were murdered or disappeared in Peru. These experiences traumatized me as a child and ingrained in me a commitment to solidarity and to community as a practice. I could not fathom such cruelty. How did we forget the lessons of our ancestors, abandon the knowledge that we are all interconnected and that our fates are inextricably linked? The jarring contrast between the human cruelty and the natural beauty all around me made me look to nature as a respite and as a teacher. My home in Lima is about 2 blocks from a park that overlooks the ocean on a cliff. So even on days when the terror reigned among humans, I could hear and watch the seabirds flying around, tending to their needs, seemingly unbothered by humans killing each other. Empires came and went, and the birds were clear that survival depends on the well-being of the whole flock. The birds offered lessons in community that humans simply failed to learn. I used to get lost in daydreams, imagining growing up to become a National Geographic photographer, savoring the thought of travel and a lifetime of observing and learning from nature. And then in 1983, my family uprooted, leaving our extended family, my neighborhood, and our culture behind. I remember some of our neighbors in Lima telling us how people who moved to the US made it rich. I do not think they were talking about a family of 5 living on a graduate school scholarship, however. So we moved from the chaotic metropolis of Lima to a very quaint and quiet college town of Charlottesville, Virginia. Because I didn't speak English, I became really good at observing behavior. Watching people at school and the shockingly empty streets, I realized that people organized themselves differently in this new country. The way they greeted each other, the distance between them when they stood, the rhythm of their walk and their speech. I can still remember the feeling of my brain being on overdrive, scanning my environment, trying to decipher people's expressions and intentions. I really missed Lima. I missed the ocean, my extended family, and frankly, I missed feeling like I belonged. I no longer worried about the violence that had become so endemic in my hometown of Lima, but nothing had prepared me for the feeling of being excluded from the broader community. I felt out of sync with those around me and swallowed by the experience of being othered. In this vast land of highways and vending machines, neither of which we had in the same way in Peru, I found solace in nature again. In our neighborhood with the tall trees, and I got to climb on them, and I would watch the squirrels, the deers, and the ducks, none of which we had in Lima either. So I started feeding the ducks, and soon a mother duck and her ducklings started coming back to our house as regular visitors. She seemed just as concerned with her ducklings as my mother seemed with hers. I learned that ducks, like people, are highly social animals and can actually become depressed if separated from their flock. More lessons from birds, I thought, as I sorted through feelings of being uprooted. Now, while waves of people left Peru in the 1980s, fleeing the violence and the instability, my parents made it clear to us that it was never their intention to stay in the US. We saw ourselves as Peruvians, temporarily living elsewhere. We spoke only Spanish at home, just as I have done with my own children, and our family became an island of our very specific blend of Peruvian culture within the US. So becoming an immigrant was actually a gradual and unintended transition, and it has shaped my view of the world, of community, and my sense of belonging just as much, if not more, than Peruvian culture itself. With the endless adaptation, code switching, overfunctioning, and existential longing that comes along with being an immigrant. One foot in each world, but really belonging to neither. During this lengthy becoming an immigrant, my family and I returned to Peru twice, for about a year each time, both during the 80s. During these extended visits, I really experienced a community out of sync. It was completely out of sync with the elegant dance of the seabirds that I got to watch out my window. Like the time that one of our neighbors was shot to death by the military for driving past curfew. He had gone out to get his mother a sandwich right before curfew started. Or the time that I watched in shock as my bedroom windows would swell like a bubble under the pressure of a bomb that had gone off a block away. All of this shaped me and my understanding of community in ways that I could not fully understand at the time, and frankly, in ways that I am still untangling. Despite my childhood dreams of becoming a National Geographic photographer, by the time I got to college, I had decided to study psychology, hoping to better understand humans and to work in the service of healing, which I was very clear there was a lot of need for. While in college, I learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which places self-actualization at the pinnacle, above physiological needs, safety, love, belonging, and esteem needs. What I didn't learn in college was that Maslow had spent time with the Siksika nation of what is now Canada and adapted many of the Siksika beliefs and ways to develop his theory. Now, for Maslow, the individual was the most important operating unit. So he put it at the center of his theory. But in Siksika culture, just like in my culture and many other cultures around the world, community is at the heart of actualization. And the pinnacle of human development is a community that leaves no one behind. This felt like the answer to the anxieties I had experienced as a child. A community that leaves no one behind, committed to caring for each other. That's what I wanted to devote myself to, a community sustained by a scaffolding of shared values and grounded in interconnectedness. So unlike Maslow, I moved away from focusing on the individual and discovered public health, a field that pulled the collective well-being at the center of all its efforts. I took what I learned in public health, which aligned quite beautifully with the values I was raised with of solidarity and mutuality, and put it to practice working in nonprofits, local government, academia, grassroots organizing, and for the past 10 years in philanthropy. Just over 3 years ago, my story added a new chapter when I transplanted my family to Maine to join the Sewall Foundation. I came to Maine because of the mission of the Sewall Foundation. It speaks to my belief that all living things are interconnected, and that we absolutely cannot move on equity or justice unless we address the well-being of all living things. It's been an honor to work with the team at Sewall, and I'm profoundly grateful and lucky to have a job that aligns with my values. Working somewhere that centers interconnectedness of all living things has felt like home. And because of the pandemic, I have actually spent a lot of time at home. I've been working from my office home in Brunswick, where I occasionally get to see and hear the seagulls. And in those moments, I'm reminded of the stories of the Incas and the seabirds and the seagulls that I used to see out of my home in Lima. The last 2 years of our collective story have been so incredibly painful and hard in so many ways. For me, Peru, becoming the nation with the highest COVID mortality rate during the pandemic, was devastating. Watching loved ones fall ill and not be able to find oxygen to sustain life, it brought back memories of the Peru of my childhood. And it made me think about how values determine how we organize ourselves, and how we organize ourselves reinforces our values for better or for worse. In the past 2 years, I also watched a field that I've considered my professional home fail to act on its central commitments. Public health failed to live up to its code of ethics in this country. And not to be too much of a bummer this morning, but the past 2 years have been replete with emotional flashbacks for me. Racism, sexism, violence, climate disasters, the comfort of the few over the safety of the many, I over we, everywhere you turn. But the story of humanity is not linear, and we are still evolving, thankfully. So I am an eternal optimist. Not because I believe that I or us can change the world, or that I will even see the fruits of my efforts during my lifetime. I am an optimist because I trust nature, because I know I am but a tiny piece of a much bigger ecosystem, and that gives me hope. And whether we remember it or not, humans are children of nature. We are the children of Pachamama. When it feels like my story is turning away from what I value the most, I turn to nature, and I remember to look to the birds. I remember that my story is linked to the stories of those around me and those yet to come. My story is connected to those I don't even know and cannot see. I ground in the knowledge that nature is the key to creating a community that is guided by solidarity, trust, and love. In learning from the birds, I understand that the greatest power available to us is not that of the hero. It is in the practice of community as an acknowledgement that we cannot do this alone. The practice of community is particularly important when it is challenging, when it isn't obvious, when there is pain, when there is loss, and when there is difference. My story has taught me to dream of community as murmuration. Murmuration is what you see on videos on either side of me. It is this magnificent, mesmerizing dance of hundreds, sometimes thousands of birds flying in unison with a common destination. It is a beautiful show of interconnectedness, and guided by shared direction, the birds trust each other, to move in a way that allows the full flock to travel safely, preventing collision and protecting from predators. With shared fate and purpose, they offer each other shelter, warmth, and knowledge. So let's practice community as murmuration, embracing a shared goal for our collective well-being by working at the local level and responding to needs across the community, whether we can see them ourselves or not, because we understand that it's all connected, that we are all connected. In murmuration, there is no single leader. It is a fluid show of distributed leadership throughout the flock. Murmuration is massive, yet composed of small, localized action, coordinated by individual birds synchronizing with the 7 birds around it. They don't have to know what every bird is doing, just those closest to them. How we organize ourselves is rooted in and transmits our values. When we practice community as murmuration, we are not alone. We are part of a whole bigger than ourselves. We are members of local communities that hold us in our pain and in our joy, connected by the realization of our shared fate. Leadership is fluid and distributed, moving dynamically so we can fly in sync and adapt to emerging winds. Resources and information are shared, with collective well-being as everyone's responsibility. The practice of community as murmuration is a dance. It is a creative process ever emerging. I dream of community as murmuration, moving together in our local rhythms towards a common destination, connected by shared values and soaring on the winds of solidarity, trust, and love. Thank you for inviting me here today, a newcomer to this community. And before I leave, I want to challenge each of you to learn from the birds as well, and to practice community as murmuration. Intentionally connect with 7 people seated near you today. And when you leave this event, challenge yourself to connect with 7 people whom you don't normally connect with to expand your understanding and your practice of community. Thank you.